Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the last lesson of the season, last lesson of the year. I'm going to finish up chapter 11, and I really don't want to start another one for one more day. So I'm really sorry we can't be together. I was really looking forward to that. I was looking forward to our Christmas party, but we will have a super epic party when we get back. And I don't know, I'll think of something over Christmas break to make it extra special for you guys. All right, we are in the last couple sections of chapter 11. On page 263 to 266, there's some really interesting blurbs about various first ladies, and I would recommend or even assign you to read all those. There are some very interesting stories there. First ladies have often had a big impact on their husbands and on America as a whole. There's some very interesting ideas here. And there's some extras that are in my book that I'm definitely going to read to you when we get back, if I remember that in a few weeks. But we are going to be, after that, on executive organization, starting on page 267. All right, so it's not just the president who's running the executive branch. He has an underling called the vice president. What does the Constitution say about the vice president? Not very much at all. He is the president of the Senate, which means he gets to preside over the Senate, but he does not get to vote except for in case of a tie. So presiding over the Senate literally means nothing but point to someone and say, okay, you can talk now. Okay, it's your turn to talk. Okay, it's your turn to talk. And hardly anything else. So the vice president is almost never in the Senate. This is a meaningless job if you do not get to vote. And typically the results of a vote are going to be known days in advance. You're going to know who's going to vote which way. So the vice president only shows up in case of a tie, and there's very rarely any ties. If I remember correctly, Vice President Pence only had to break like 2 or 3 ties in his 4 years as vice president. There were only a handful of votes that were that close. Some vice presidents have had to break many more ties, but that's not very common. Really, the vice president is a spare. He's just spare parts. He's just there in case the president gets hurt. It's a backup. Because in an emergency, we need a president. And an emergency that gets the president out of commission, we cannot wait 2 or 3 or 4 years till the next election. We can't even have an emergency election. If there is something going on right now, we cannot hold an emergency election in 2 or 3 months' time. It would take months to get everyone ready, and it would just be a huge to-do. No, we need someone right now to hold the reins of office. Harry Truman was speaking about how useless the vice presidency is. On page 267, he says, "The opportunities afforded by the vice presidency, particularly the presidency of the Senate, do not come. They are there to be seized. The vice president's influence on legislation depends on his personality and his ability, and especially the respect which he commands from the senators. Here is one instance in which it is the man who makes the office, not the office the man." He says he really has no official influence in lawmaking. Tons of unofficial influence, though. If he talks to senators and is able to persuade senators to vote his way, that's huge. And sometimes the vice president representing the president does represent the party leadership. And if you get an influential and charismatic vice president, they might be able to persuade lots of senators to vote his way, but sometimes not. Sometimes the vice president is pretty useless. The vice president often has a lot more unofficial work than official work. So often just going around from town to town, making speeches, shaking hands, kissing babies, opening up malls, just going to various events, maybe showing up to a baseball game or something to represent the president when the president can't show up, and not really doing a whole lot of anything. There have been people who have turned down the vice presidency. Someone says, "Hey, I'd like to appoint you vice president to replace the last guy." No, thanks. In total, 14 vice presidents have become president. 8 have become president after a death. A few of those were assassinations. A few of those were just natural causes. There was a president who died a month in. There was another president who died just a year in. A couple of presidents died 1 year into office. FDR died about a year into his last term. One vice president became president when the president resigned after a scandal. That, of course, was Nixon resigning and Gerald Ford becoming the president. 5 vice presidents have then gone on to run for office and have been elected. Most recently, George Bush Sr. was Reagan's vice president. Plenty more vice presidents have run and have lost. And that is because as vice president, since you don't get much done, you're not going to be in the news very much, and you don't get a lot of notches on your belt. You don't get much done, so you can't brag about your accomplishments in office because you really haven't accomplished much in office. Whereas a senator or congressman, they probably have a lot more influence and they can brag about, hey, I got this law passed, I got that law passed, I got this public works done. Even a governor can brag about how well they've run their state. And the vice president says, well, I worked with the last guy. Oh, H.W. Bush wasn't the most recent one. Biden is, of course. Wow, I can't believe I forgot that. Ugh, need more caffeine. Yeah, Biden was Obama's vice president, of course. Duh. And again, when Biden was running, I don't know how much speeches you've heard from Biden when he was running. It seemed to me like he was doing a lot more promises about what he wanted to do as president, more than accomplishments that he got done as vice president. The things that he got done are really things that Obama got done. That he's like, yeah, well, I was there too. So the vice presidency, not a really powerful office, but it could lead to the presidency. Of course, our very first vice president, John Adams, won our second presidency. As the years have gone on, the vice president has had a more public role than in the past. John Adams, our first vice president, said, I am the vice president. In this, I am nothing, but I may be everything. I'm nothing right now, but if Washington dies, I get to be everything. One of the most powerful jobs in our government, president, is seconded by one of the least powerful jobs, vice president. In more recent years, the vice president's job has been to balance the ticket, so get another demographic in. So old white guy from Massachusetts balanced by a young, not white lady from, where's Harris from again? I keep forgetting to look that up. I don't care. The vice president also serves on various cabinet level meetings. The vice president is usually an advisor, completely unofficial, but they usually sit in on a lot of board meetings and help advise the president. They're often on the National Security Council, which is a group of the top spy masters and generals and people discussing national security. This is bottom of page 267. There's often special commissions in charge of fixing a problem, and the vice president sometimes gets in charge of that. For instance, one of President Biden's goals was to fix the border situation, which I think many presidents have had that as a goal in the last 100 years or so, and it's not fixed yet. But he put Vice President Harris in charge of the border situation, and that's a very, very controversial thing, and honestly, there's not a lot that we can do to make the whole problem just go away. There's only so much we can do to help, right? And a lot of people close to the vice president say she got really mad at being in charge of what she considers an unwinnable problem. It'd be like making your vice president in charge of peace in the Middle East. Like, don't think that's going to happen. We can try. Maybe we can get it a little bit better, but we're not going to solve that problem today. The vice president often represents the president in various meetings. Maybe they'll go to a big business meeting, if like Walmart and Target and all these big guys get together and are discussing their politics. Maybe the vice president goes and talks to them. Maybe he goes to a party, the Met Gala, the Oscars or whatever. The president's too busy to go, so he'll send the VP. The 25th Amendment cleared up the role of the president. This is on page 268. Previously, the Constitution didn't really say what happened when there is no vice president. If there was no vice president, excuse me, his job was so unimportant that you just wait till the next election to elect a new vice president. So actually, there were quite a few years in American history where there was no vice president. Any one of those vice presidents who took over from the president when the president died or was incapacitated or resigned, they didn't get a vice president. And now the 25th Amendment says, well, they get to appoint one, just like you can appoint any other high official, you can appoint a new vice president. That's what we do today. It also says what happens if the president doesn't die or resigns, but is incapacitated for a short period of time. How can the vice president become in charge and then give that up? There's been multiple examples of a president undergoing surgery where they're under anesthetic, and you need someone to have the nuclear codes and all that to take over in an emergency. So you would want the vice president to take that job until you have the president back on their feet. That happened recently with President Biden with a medical checkup yet to go under anesthesia. So Vice President Harris was in charge for just like one day, I think, just for a few hours out of the day. And you can read more about that on page 269. Then the Executive Office of the President, EOP, came about when FDR decided he needed more help in the executive branch, needs more workers. This is the most influential part of the executive branch. There's about 400 people there, and they have their fingers in all the pies. They get to make a bunch of different decisions, and they oversee a lot of other groups, which we're going to talk about more in next chapter, which is the bureaucracy, which we'll get to after break. Then there's a whole bunch of acronyms, the NSC, National Security Council. What is the OMB? I'm sorry, there's so many acronyms here. Office of Management and Budget, lots of different councils and things. The NSC has ties to the CIA and the Defense Department and the State Departments, intelligence gathering, policy formulation, crisis management. The Office of Management and Budget prepares the nation's annual budget for Congress and coordinates policy amongst the departments. And we'll talk more about that later, but lots of important stuff there. The cabinet is probably the main basic function of the executive branch. It is done by the various cabinet departments. In England, the cabinet secretaries come from Parliament and stay members of Parliament. So in England, the executive and legislative branches are like together. The Prime Minister comes from Parliament, and cabinet members do as well. In America, they are separate jobs. They are appointed jobs. They only work for the president, although they do have to be confirmed by the Senate. And we're going to talk more about the cabinet next chapter as well. There are 15 cabinet offices: State, Treasury, Defense, Justice, Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security. 15 different cabinet level organizations, and they each have their own secretary and are very important. There's other less important departments, such as the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Trade Representative, Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Ambassador to the United Nations, and the Director of National Intelligence, DNI. Lots of other groups. I don't know why that's there. Yeah, so there's about 50 agencies that work for the government that are much, much smaller than a cabinet level. Sometimes these agencies start out small and then become so big that they become a cabinet level department, but right now they're rather small. Those directors are appointed just like the cabinet level people are. On page 271, talks about governing wisely. How can a president avoid some of the major problems and pitfalls and traps of the office? Presidents have very vague powers, but very broad powers. So there is this constant temptation for presidential overreach. They're allowed to do an awful lot. And so they can be tempted to just try to run the government all by themselves. Or even say, well, I don't want to obey Congress. I don't want to obey the Supreme Court. I don't want to follow the law. I'm the president. I should be able to do whatever I want. And as we've said a million times before, freedom and liberty is not the ability to do whatever you want. It's the ability to do right. Presidents are very powerful. Are they all powerful? No, they're not dictators. They're not kings. They should not have the ability to do whatever they want. Presidents have to obey the law, just like everyone else. Even though they help write the law, they still have to obey the law. Andrew Jackson ignored Congress and he ignored the Supreme Court when he created the Trail of Tears. Americans were stealing Indian land and stealing their gold, and Congress and the Supreme Court ordered soldiers to go protect the borders from Americans and protect the Indians, our neighbors that we had treaties with, enforce our treaties, protect those people. Andrew Jackson decided to kill a bunch of them and kick them off their land. He felt like he was powerful enough that he could do whatever he wanted, and he did, and he had no consequences for that. About a third of the Cherokee died, which we would call genocide today, and a war crime. He ignored the Supreme Court, completely disobeyed them. He should have been impeached, should have been thrown in jail, but he wasn't. He got away with it, and other presidents feel like they can get away with stuff too. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Nixon, of course, famously spied on his political opponents. He broke the law to break into a private office and install listening devices on his political opponents. That is completely illegal. You're not allowed to act like a dictator like that. I'm sure you could think of many other presidents who have done many other wrong things that are not just, politically different than me. For instance, I think Obamacare was not the wisest solution. I do believe that there are major medical pricing problems in America. I'm not sure that Obamacare was the best solution to the problem, but I don't think that it was illegal. They wrote a law. I don't think it's unconstitutional, even if it might be unwise. But there are plenty of times that presidents have actually broken the law or attempted to break the law. Sometimes they get caught, sometimes there's punishments, sometimes there's no punishments. They get away with it, and that's really not great. Presidents are not above the law. They're not kings. They're not dictators. They have to submit to authority. It can be very difficult for someone in authority to submit to authority of their own. I know that. I'm in authority in school, but I also have the school board and Pastor Green above me, and it can be difficult for me to have to be told no sometimes. If I have an idea, sometimes they tell me no. And, I have an authority just like everyone else has an authority. Even the people on top, so-called, have someone above them. And by the way, each one of us has to submit to authority. You need to obey the government, even if they ask you to do something or tell you to do something you don't like. There is only one moral reason to disobey government, and that is if they're completely going against Scripture. If they're making a law that you think is foolish or that you think is unfair or unwise, there's lots of political things you can do to fix that. You can go to a rally, you can write a complaint, you can sue in court, you could vote for someone else, you can yell on Facebook. There's a million things you can do. But unless it disobeys Scripture, I would highly recommend that you do the moral thing, which is to obey, even if you're fighting that law. Okay, you are under the law. Romans 13 says that the government represents God, and they might not be doing a great job at it, but they are in charge. And we do have to obey whether we like it or not. And honestly, a better test of obedience is not if you obey a law that you like, it's if you obey a law that you disagree with. Obeying a president that you love is easy. Obeying a president you can't stand is hard. Obeying a law you completely agree with is easy. Obeying a law that you disagree with is hard. That's the real test of obedience. And honestly, it's a test of obedience to God, not just a test of obedience to the government, because the government represents God. Romans 13. I think it's kind of rare for the government to write a law that or at least the government of America, to write a law that completely disregards Scripture. Especially one that forces you to do something you don't like. There are laws that allow maybe unscriptural things like drugs and abortion, but they're not forcing you to do that. Anyway, rant over. How do you decide, how do you judge a president, decide if they've been a good or a bad president? Every president has flaws. If you think that your politician, your favorite guy or girl is perfect, you don't see their flaws. You've bought into political lies and propaganda. Wake up, sheeple. Every president has had flaws. Many of them have had major flaws. And it's kind of sad to think that some of the presidents that have done the most good for America also did an awful lot of bad. For instance, when you think of our founding fathers, some of our founding fathers did amazing things for America, but also did some amazingly awful stuff. Thomas Jefferson putting in writing, all men are created equal, putting in writing some of the foundational ideas about freedom and liberty, and yet he owned 600 slaves. Like, how do you reconcile those two things? People have been wondering that for centuries now. How do you reconcile the wonderful things that Jefferson did and the horrible things that Jefferson did? How can you put them together? Should we be praising him? Should we be, you know, earning him an effigy? Should we have a monument to him for the great things he did? Should we destroy the Jefferson Memorial because of the bad things he did? People have been arguing about that for forever, since he's been around. And many other presidents and politicians have done wonderful things and have done terrible things, and it is hard to judge one without the other. We need to do our best to find a clear picture, an honest picture of who this person was and what they did for America, both the success and the failures. It is unfair to see only the successes or only the failures. It is inaccurate and not historical. Often, the presidents who were considered the best presidents were the ones who led during a time of a great national crisis, a national trouble. For instance, wartime presidents. George Washington, very famous. Usually he's better known for being a general in the Revolution than for his actual politics as president. Most people know that he was president, but do you know a whole lot of laws that he got passed? That's not what you remember him for. You remember him for his leadership in the Revolution. Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, FDR in the Great Depression and World War II. If there's this major crisis and someone rises to the occasion and leads the nation through that, that can have a lasting impact on people. If your 4 years as president were just, easygoing and nothing to report, then you don't get remembered. The worst presidents are often known for being bad because, number one, they were incompetent. There was a problem and they just couldn't solve the problem. They didn't know how to solve the problem. Think of Jimmy Carter, one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet. At age like 94, he's still building houses for poor people. Nice guy, great guy. Not very effective as a president, though. I'm not just saying that because he was a Democrat. But when there was an oil crisis, he said, well, everyone put on a sweater so you could turn the thermostat down. And people didn't really consider that a very effective solution to the oil crisis. So incompetence or surrounded by corruption. Psalm 1 says, be careful who you're friends with. And there were several presidents who all their buddies got chucked in jail. I think of Ulysses S. Grant, one of America's all-time best generals ever, and one of our all-time worst presidents ever. All of his buddies got thrown in jail. His brother-in-law got thrown in jail for bribery. His private secretary got thrown in jail. A bunch of his cabinet members got thrown in jail. All his buddies were corrupt. And apparently no one was able to accuse the president himself of doing any wrongdoing. But when all your buddies are going to jail, that is just embarrassing. Look at the people that the president's surrounding himself with. Jesus said the greatest leaders are the servants. And the world sees that as well. It's not just a spiritual idea. The world recognizes leaders who help the people rather than taking from the people. They're giving to the people, whether it's in the business world or in the political world. Some politicians work, 80 hours a week, working exceptionally hard to help America in one way or another. They're working on military strategy or economic strategy. They're working really hard to do something. Other presidents are just patting themselves in the back all the time. They're constantly on the news. They're constantly on Twitter or whatever. They're constantly saying, hey, everyone, look at me. Look how amazing I am. And Some people buy into that and like, oh yeah, you are amazing. Some people are like, why are you strutting around like a peacock all the time? Stop patting yourself on the back. You're not here to make yourself famous. You're here to help America. Um, Abraham Lincoln was an exceptionally humble person. He did not like going to parties in his honor. He rarely did that. When he was asked to give a speech at Gettysburg, the guy in front of him spoke for like 2 hours, and it was being like, wah, wah, wah. And then Abraham Lincoln just gets up and speaks for 7 minutes from the heart and sits back down. I'm not in the presidency to be famous. I'm in the presidency to lead America. And servant leadership is a sign of greatness.